Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I am 35 years old. What I am about to share with you is deeply personal, a story about navigating the most intense grief imaginable, compounded by betrayal and misunderstanding from the people who were supposed to be my closest support. What happened next was even worse than the initial pain. My own community, the people I had grown up with and lived alongside my entire life, turned their backs and called me weak. But this story isn't just about how they tried to break me. It's about how I found strength I never knew I had and built something beautiful out of the ashes. Stay with me, because I promise to tell you the full story, every painful step, and every hard-won victory. Before I get into it, I want to ask you, where are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have ever felt like the people you trusted most misunderstood you, or if you've been judged when you were at your most vulnerable, please hit that like button, so I know I'm not alone. And if you want to hear more stories about overcoming adversity and finding your voice, please consider subscribing. My life, before everything changed, felt solid. Not perfect, no one's is, but grounded. I lived in the same small town where I grew up. My father was, well, he was my rock. Kind, steady, quiet but strong. My mother was different, more volatile, more focused on appearances and what others thought. I also had a younger brother, David. We weren't particularly close as adults, but there was a baseline of shared history. The solidity shattered with my father's sudden death. A heart attack, swift and brutal. He was only 62. It wasn't just the loss of a parent, it was the loss of my anchor. He was the one I went to for quiet advice, the one who listened without judgment, the one who could always make me feel okay, even when things were difficult. The first few days were a blur of shock and sorrow. Relatives descended, the funeral home needed decisions made, and my mother was performing. That's the only way I can describe it now. She was putting on a show of the grieving widow, but there was an edge to it, a self-pity that felt performative even through my own haze of grief. My brother seemed lost, quiet and withdrawn, which was unusual for him. I, meanwhile, felt like I was drowning. The world had gone muted, colors less vibrant, sounds less sharp. Every breath felt like an effort. The community was wonderful at first. Meals arrived, cards piled up, neighbors offered help with errands. In a small town, people rally. I felt a sense of being held, supported by the familiar faces I'd known my whole life. But grief is not linear, and it is not pretty. The initial wave of support lasts only so long, and then people expect you to start recovering,
pulling yourself together,
getting back to normal. But my normal was gone, and my grief wasn't just about missing my father. It quickly became complicated, tangled up with family dynamics that started to unravel with him gone. My mother, particularly, seemed to view my grief, or perhaps the way I expressed it, as a personal affront or a competition. One of the first signs came maybe a week after the funeral. We were going through some of my father's things. It was agonizing, sifting through his life. I found a box of old photographs. Happy memories, frozen in time. I teared up, holding a picture of him teaching me to ride my bike, his big hands steadying the seat.
My mother saw me.
"Oh, Sarah, really?" she sighed, her voice dripping with impatience. "Must you be so dramatic? We are all grieving. You aren't the only one who lost someone." I was stunned.
Dramatic?
I was sitting in a box of my dead father's memories, feeling the gut-wrenching pain of his absence, and she called me dramatic. It was a casual comment, easily dismissible on its own, maybe born of her own stress, I told myself. But it landed like a small, sharp stone. It wasn't an isolated incident. If I cried, I was being overly emotional. If I withdrew slightly, needing space, I was being aloof and unsupportive of her grief. If I tried to talk about my father, to share a memory, she would often interrupt or steer the conversation back to herself, to her loss, her feelings. It became clear that my grief was inconvenient and, in her eyes, somehow less valid than hers. Simultaneously, subtle shifts began to occur in how she spoke about me to others. Initially, it was masked as concern. Poor Sarah, she's taking it so hard, she'd say to relatives on the phone, just loud enough for me to hear. It sounded sympathetic, but the underlying tone implied I wasn't handling things well, that I was fragile or perhaps excessively sensitive. Then came the misrepresentations. My father had left a modest life insurance policy and some savings. He'd also left a small, slightly neglected cabin by a lake, a place filled with my fondest childhood memories. He'd always said it would be mine one day. His will stipulated that the cabin was to go to me, and the rest of his assets were to be divided between my mother, David, and me. It seemed straightforward. My mother, however, had different ideas. She felt the cabin should be sold and the money divided. It wasn't fair, she argued, for me to get the cabin and a share of the money, while she and David only got a share of the money. This was despite the fact the cabin wasn't worth a huge amount, required significant repairs, and held immense sentimental value to me. When I gently but firmly pushed back, explaining how much the cabin meant to me and honoring my father's wishes, she didn't argue overtly to my face. Instead, the narrative began to shift. Sarah is being very difficult about the will, I overheard her saying to her sister on the phone. She's being greedy, insisting on keeping that old cabin when we could all use the money. It's like she doesn't care about anyone but herself, not even about helping me through this. Greedy? Not caring about anyone but myself? This twisted my deep emotional connection to a place tied to my father and childhood into selfishness. This was the real betrayal beginning, not just dismissing my feelings, but actively creating a false narrative about my character and intentions. These whispers didn't stay within the family. In a small town, news travels fast, and distorted news travels faster. My mother was a master of passive-aggressive manipulation and generating sympathy for herself. She talked to her friends at the grocery store, at church, at community gatherings, painting a picture of herself as the struggling widow trying to keep her family together, while her daughter, me, was making things harder with my stubbornness and selfish demands regarding the inheritance. I started noticing subtle changes in how people treated me in town. A neighbor who used to stop and chat would just wave awkwardly from a distance. Friends of my mother's who had been so sympathetic right after the funeral seemed colder, their smiles not reaching their eyes. There were veiled comments. One afternoon, at the local market, Mrs. Henderson, who had known me since I was in kindergarten, cornered me by the vegetable stand. "Sarah, dear," she said, her voice low, ostensibly kind but with a sharp glint in her eyes. "Your mother tells me you're having a tough time adjusting. And with everything else, the cabin and all," she paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "I'm grieving, Mrs. Henderson," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's hard." "Of course, dear, of course," she said, though her expression suggested anything but understanding. "But you must remember your poor mother is grieving too. And David. Family must stick together, especially now. It's not the time for disagreements over things." Things. She meant the cabin. She meant money. She had heard the distorted story and had judged me based on it. My face felt hot. It wasn't just my mother's private opinion anymore. The judgment was spreading. The community wasn't seeing Sarah, the grieving daughter who cherished her father's memory and wished to honor his legacy. They were seeing the version of me painted by my mother, selfish, difficult, causing trouble during a time of sorrow. The feeling of isolation intensified. It wasn't just the lack of support for my grief. It was active, albeit often subtle, disapproval. People who I thought were friends seemed uncomfortable around me. Invitations to casual get-togethers dwindled. I felt like I was walking around with an invisible mark on my forehead, a sign that said difficult or selfish. My grief became a lonely burden. I was navigating the crushing weight of losing my father while simultaneously feeling alienated by my family and misunderstood by my community. The place that had always felt like home now felt hostile. I tried, desperately, to make things right, or at least to understand. I tried talking to my mother again, calmly explaining my feelings about the cabin, trying to bridge the gap. "Mom, the cabin, it's not about the money," I said one evening, sitting across from her in the living room that felt too empty without my father's presence. It's where Dad taught me to fish, where we'd tell stories by the fire. It's him. Keeping it is keeping a piece of him alive. She just looked at me, her expression hardening. Oh, Sarah, you always sentimentalize everything. Be practical. We need the money. And frankly, your attitude about this is just making my grief worse. You're making this all about you. Again, the twist. My love and memory twisted into selfishness. My attempt at connection reframed as an attack on her. It was a dead end. Every conversation led back to her pain, her needs, and how I was failing to meet them by daring to have my own feelings or desires. I even tried talking to David, my brother. He was caught in the middle, clearly uncomfortable. When I brought up Mom's comments and how the community seemed to be reacting, he just shrugged. Mom's just stressed, Sarah, he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. Dad dying is hard on her. Maybe you should just let the cabin go. It's causing a lot of problems. He hadn't heard my side. Or if he hadn't processed it. He was accepting Mom's narrative, siding with the path of least resistance. It hurt more than I expected. My own brother, unwilling to see past the surface, accepting the distorted version of events. The feeling of being weak started to creep in, not because I was grieving, but because I felt powerless against the narrative that was being built around me. How do you fight whispers? How do you defend yourself against implied accusations and sympathetic sighs? Every attempt I made to explain myself seemed to backfire, only fueling the idea that I was being difficult or overly sensitive. The community's perception, fed by my mother's carefully crafted victimhood, solidified. I wasn't just grieving, I was the difficult one, the ungrateful daughter, the one who couldn't cope. I remember a specific incident that solidified this feeling of being judged and misunderstood. It was the town's annual summer picnic. I hesitated to go, but a few old friends encouraged me, saying it would be good for me to get out. I went, hoping for a sense of normalcy, a connection to the community that once felt like family. It was worse than staying home. As I walked around, I felt eyes on me. Conversations seemed to stop as I approached. The polite nods felt strained. When I joined a group of women I'd known for years, the conversation about bake sale plans was abruptly changed to an overly cheerful, slightly awkward discussion about the weather. No one asked me how I was, not really. Not about my grief, not about anything substantial. It was as if they didn't want to engage with the problem that was me. Later, I saw my mother across the park, surrounded by her friends, talking animatedly. Their heads turned towards me. They all looked, and then they looked away, some with expressions of pity, others with something that felt like disapproval. I saw Mrs. Henderson among them, shaking her head slightly as she listened to my mother. It hit me then with the force of a physical blow. The community wasn't just passively accepting my mother's story, they were actively participating in my isolation. They saw my withdrawal, my sadness, my struggle to even function sometimes, and interpreted it through the lens my mother had provided. Weakness, selfishness, drama. They didn't see a woman wrestling with profound loss and complex family dynamics. They saw someone who was supposedly making things hard for her poor grieving mother and being stubborn about money. I left the picnic early, tears blurring my vision. I drove to the lake cabin. It was overgrown, the porch sagging, just as my mother had described. But as I walked inside, the scent of old wood and lake water was instantly comforting. I sat on the dusty floor in the main room, the afternoon sunbeams highlighting the motes of dust dancing in the air. I thought of my father, patient and smiling, teaching me to skip stones just outside. This wasn't just an old cabin, it was a sanctuary of memory. Sitting there, surrounded by the quiet echoes of happier times, a different kind of feeling began to surface amidst the pain and isolation. Anger. Anger at my mother for her cruelty and manipulation. Anger at David for his passive acceptance. Anger at the community for their swift judgment and lack of empathy. And yes, anger at myself for letting their narrative make me feel weak, for internalizing their misinterpretations. In that quiet, dusty cabin, I realized I had been trying to win a game I couldn't win by playing by their rules. I was trying to gain their validation, their understanding, their sympathy, using the very tools, explanation, emotional honesty, appeals to shared history that my mother was expertly using against me by twisting them into evidence of my supposed flaws. Their calls of weakness echoed in my mind. But sitting there, deciding not to sell the cabin despite the pressure, despite the gossip, felt like the first truly strong thing I had done in months. It was honoring my father, yes, but it was also honoring myself, my memories, my right to grieve, and to keep what was promised to me. I stopped trying to explain myself to the community. I stopped trying to engage with my mother on an emotional level about the inheritance or my grief. I set a boundary regarding the cabin. It was mine, gifted by my father, and it was not for sale. End of discussion. This was met with further icy silence and more subtle digs, reported back to me by well-meaning or perhaps gossipy acquaintances. This period was incredibly difficult. I was still grieving deeply, but now I was also navigating active family conflict and social isolation. There were days I felt utterly alone, wondering if I was making a mistake, if I should just give in to make the pressure stop. But then I'd remember that feeling in the cabin, the quiet strength of standing my ground. I started spending more time at the cabin. I began clearing the overgrowth, making small repairs. It was physical work, a tangible way to process intangible pain. As I worked, sometimes neighbors from the lake would stop by. Unlike the townspeople, these were people I didn't know as well, less entrenched in the local gossip mill centered around my mother. One elderly woman, Martha, who lived a few cabins down, saw me struggling to clear a fallen branch. She came over, offered a hand. We talked while we worked. I didn't spill the whole story of my family drama, but I talked about my father, about how much the cabin meant to me, about the difficulty of grief. She listened. Really listened. Without judgment. She talked about losing her own husband years ago, the unexpected waves of sorrow, the ways people sometimes say the wrong thing. That simple act of listening, of shared understanding, was a lifeline. It made me realize how starved I was for genuine connection. As I slowly began to reclaim my space, both physically at the cabin and emotionally within myself, I started to encounter others in the community who were also struggling, often silently. There was young Tom, whose mother had passed away recently, feeling lost and misunderstood by his friends who didn't know how to handle his sadness. There was Eleanor, whose husband had died a few years back, still carrying a heavy weight of grief and loneliness, feeling like she was expected to be over it by now. I saw in them the same isolation I had felt, the same pressure to grieve, correctly or quickly, the same feeling of being judged or avoided because their pain made others uncomfortable. An idea began to form, sparked by those conversations at the cabin and my own painful experience. What if there was a place, or a way, for people to connect and share their experiences of grief without judgment? A place where weakness was understood not as a flaw, but simply as part of the human experience of loss. It started small. I invited Tom and Eleanor to the cabin for tea. We talked, hesitantly at first, then more openly. It felt safe, validating. We weren't being dramatic, or difficult, or weak. We were just people hurting, trying to find our way. Word spread, slowly, quietly, through informal channels. Someone else knew someone whose sister was struggling after a miscarriage. Another friend mentioned a colleague whose parent was ill. The need was clearly there, beneath the town's surface of polite expectation and judgment. I decided to start a small, informal support group. I called it the Grief Empowerment Network. The name was intentional. I didn't want it to be just a place to share sadness, but a place where people could find strength within their grief, where they could feel empowered to navigate their loss on their own terms, not according to others' expectations. I held the first meeting at the lake cabin. It felt appropriate to start there, in my sanctuary, the place that had witnessed my lowest point and the beginning of my turning point. 5 people showed up. We sat around a borrowed table, surrounded by the cabin's rustic charm. We shared stories, tears, and moments of quiet understanding. It was raw, honest, and profoundly healing. As the network grew, it operated largely outside the established social circles of the town. This was partly by design, partly because the same people who had judged me were unlikely to participate. This gave it a different energy, free from the baggage of local gossip and long-held resentments. My mother, of course, heard about it. Her reaction was typical. "Oh, Sarah is starting some sort of group," she said to David, knowing I was in the next room. "Isn't that just like her? Always needing attention, making a spectacle of her grief."
Spectacle.
Attention. Even when I was trying to do something positive to help others based on my own pain, she framed it negatively, minimizing the genuine need and twisting my motives. This time, however, her words didn't crush me. They felt distant, less powerful. I was too focused on the quiet strength I saw growing in the people who came to the network meetings. I was too focused on the validation we offered each other, a stark contrast to the invalidation I'd received. The network became my focus. It was building something tangible, something good, out of the pain and the isolation. I learned about running a group, about listening deeply, about creating a safe space. I saw people arrive looking lost and burdened and leave looking just a little bit lighter, a little less alone. Meanwhile, my relationship with my mother remained strained. The conflict over the inheritance, particularly the cabin, had solidified into a cold distance. She maintained her narrative of my selfishness to anyone who would listen. David remained on the periphery, unwilling to challenge Mom, occasionally making weak attempts at peacekeeping that usually involved telling me to just be more understanding of her. The community's perception of me didn't change overnight. Some people remained distant, influenced by the persistent negative narrative. Others, perhaps, saw the network I was building and were confused. Was this the difficult woman they had heard about? Was this making a spectacle, or was it genuine effort? The climax of this long, drawn-out conflict didn't come in a single dramatic shouting match, but in a series of smaller confrontations where I no longer backed down or tried to smooth things over. It was the cumulative effect of setting boundaries and standing firm. One particularly difficult moment occurred when my mother decided to host a small family gathering, ostensibly to try and mend fences, though I suspected it was more about appearances. I hesitated to go, but decided I would on my terms. I would be polite, present, but I would not engage in the old patterns. Almost immediately, she brought up the cabin, framing it again as this unresolved issue, sighing dramatically about the difficulty it was causing. She did this in front of a few aunts and cousins who were present. Instead of getting defensive or trying to explain, which had always failed, I looked her directly in the eye. "Mom," I said, my voice calm but firm, "we are not discussing the cabin. Dad left it to me. That is his wish, and I am honoring it. It is not causing difficulty. You are creating difficulty by refusing to accept his decision." The air went still. My aunts shifted uncomfortably. My mother's face flushed. She wasn't used to being directly challenged, especially not in front of others. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she sputtered, her voice rising. "After everything I've been through, my own daughter is so disrespectful." "It's not disrespectful to state the truth," I replied, my voice still steady. "The truth is, Dad wanted me to have the cabin. And the truth is, I am grieving him, and this place is deeply connected to my memories of him. Your desire to sell it doesn't change that. And creating stories about me being greedy or difficult because I want to keep it is unfair and untrue." It wasn't a shout, but the quiet force of speaking my truth was powerful. I saw the surprise in the eyes of my relatives. They had likely only heard my mother's side, filtered through her self-pity and manipulation. Here, directly contradicting her, was me, calm and clear. My mother, cornered, resorted to her ultimate weapon.
Tears.
She began to cry, dabbing at her eyes, murmuring about how I was attacking her, how sensitive she was, how this was proof of how unstable I was since my father died. In the past, this would have crumbled me. I would have rushed to comfort her, apologized, backed down. But I had spent months in my grief, navigating her manipulation, and building my own resilience. I saw the performance for what it was. "Your tears don't change the facts, Mom," I said, my voice softening slightly, not out of capitulation, but out of a weary acceptance of who she was. And frankly, I can't do this anymore. I will not be made to feel guilty or selfish for honoring Dad and for keeping something that is rightfully mine and means the world to me. I stood up. I love you, but I cannot continue to be in a situation where my character is misrepresented and my feelings are dismissed. I'm going to leave now. I looked at David, who still looked stunned and uncomfortable. David, if you ever want to talk, really talk, you know where I am. Then I walked out. The silence I left behind was heavy with unspoken words and fractured relationships. It was terrifying taking that step, drawing that line. But it was also incredibly liberating. I had finally stopped trying to force a connection that was toxic and had chosen my own peace and integrity instead. The aftermath was predictable. My mother doubled down on her narrative, telling everyone how I had stormed out and attacked her when she was just trying to bring the family together. She painted herself as the injured party, the victim of my supposedly volatile nature. Some community members shook their heads, confirming their existing biases. Others, however, who had witnessed the brief confrontation or heard a less biased account from the relatives present, started to see a different picture. The turning point wasn't that everyone suddenly believed me. It was that I no longer needed them to. My validation came from within, from standing up for myself, from honoring my father's wishes, and from the growing strength I found in the Grief Empowerment Network. The network continued to grow. We moved from the cabin to the small community hall, needing more space. We had weekly meetings, workshops on coping skills, and informal coffee gatherings. People from neighboring towns started coming. It became a hub of genuine support and understanding, a place where people could be authentically themselves in their grief. Working with others, hearing their stories, and seeing their progress was incredibly healing for me. It put my own struggles into perspective and showed me the universal nature of grief and the human need for connection. The very pain and isolation that my mother and community had inflicted became the fuel for building something meaningful. The judgment they cast on me for being weak in my grief pushed me to build a network that defined strength not as the absence of pain, but as the courage to face it and support others doing the same. I learned to navigate my relationship with my mother by creating firm boundaries. I limited contact, keeping interactions brief and superficial, avoiding topics that led to conflict or manipulation. It wasn't the close, loving mother-daughter relationship I had always longed for, but it was healthier. It was safe. There were still moments of sadness over the loss of what I wished we could be, but I accepted the reality of what she was capable of offering, and more importantly, what I was willing to accept. My brother David eventually reached out, hesitantly. He admitted that he hadn't understood what was happening and that Mom had put him in a difficult position. He hadn't fully grasped the depth of her manipulation or my pain. Our relationship is slowly rebuilding, based on a more honest understanding, though the rift caused by the conflict left scars. As for the community, things are different now. Some people remain committed to the narrative they were given, or are simply uncomfortable acknowledging they might have misjudged me. But many others, especially those touched by the Grief Empowerment Network, have seen a different side. They've seen my dedication, my empathy, and the positive impact of the work I'm doing. The whispers haven't completely disappeared, but they are quieter, less pervasive. And they don't sting the way they used to. I still live in the town, and I still see the people who judged me. It's not always easy. There are moments of awkwardness, reminders of the pain. But I no longer feel the need to shrink myself or justify my existence. I walk taller, grounded in the knowledge of who I am and what I've overcome. The cabin remains my sanctuary. I've fixed it up over the years, making it a warm, welcoming place, a reflection of the healing that has happened within its walls and within me. Sometimes I hold smaller, more intimate network gatherings there. Looking back, the pain of my father's death was immense, but the pain caused by the betrayal and judgment from my family and community was a different kind of wound. It was the pain of being unseen, misunderstood, and deliberately misrepresented at my most vulnerable. They called me weak when I was simply human, grieving. But in their attempt to define me by their limited understanding and harmful narratives, they inadvertently pushed me to find my own definition of strength. Strength wasn't about not crying or not feeling pain or conforming to their expectations. Strength was about feeling it all, the sorrow, the anger, the loneliness, and still standing up for myself. Strength was about refusing to accept a false identity. Strength was about taking my broken pieces and building something new, something that not only healed me, but helped heal others. The Grief Empowerment Network is proof of that. It is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest times, even when the people closest to you let you down, you can find your own light and share it with others. It's a place where people are allowed to be weak, messy, and human in their grief, and in doing so, they find their true strength. My story is a journey from heartbreak and betrayal to finding my voice and my purpose. It's about the devastating impact of toxic family dynamics and community judgment, but more importantly, it's about resilience, authenticity, and the power of building your own support system when the one you expected fails you. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to share, but I believe there is power in speaking our truth, especially after being silenced or misrepresented. If you have ever had to stand up to family members who twisted your words or intentions, or if you felt judged by your community during a difficult time, please share your experience in the comments below. Let's connect and show each other we're not alone. If this story resonated with you, if you felt any connection to the feelings of betrayal, misunderstanding, or the struggle for validation, please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories about navigating complex relationships, overcoming adversity, and finding empowerment, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you again for your time and your presence. Remember to speak your truth and never let anyone else define your worth or the validity of your feelings.